name is Marcus Fletcher, and I've been a fisherman since I could walk. I learned to fish from my father and grandfather on Lake Minnetonka in Minnesota, that vast lake that hides secrets in its depths beyond human imagination. It was in the fall of 2019, specifically the last week of October. The sky was heavy and gray, and fog wrapped around the lake as if it belonged to another world. I had planned a night fishing trip with my old friend Thomas Harper, despite my wife Emily's warnings that the weather looked ominous. But Thomas and I were seasoned fishermen. We knew that lake like the backs of our hands. We set out in Thomas's boat at dusk, loaded with gear, bait, and hot coffee. The lake was unnaturally calm. We didn't hear a single bird, not even the usual whisper of wind through the pine trees along the shore. Thomas laughed and said, "Calm before the storm, Marcus. The fish will be hungry tonight." We anchored in an area we knew well, near a small island called Ghost Island. The locals had named it that decades ago after an entire family drowned there in the 1930s. We didn't believe in superstitions, but something felt different that night. We cast our lines into the black water. An hour passed without a single bite, then two. Normally, the spot was teeming with pike and walleye, but tonight it was like fishing in a dead pond. Suddenly, I felt a hard tug on my line. Not the usual pull of a fish, something much heavier, as if I had snagged a submerged tree trunk. "My line's stuck, Thomas," I said quietly, not knowing why I was whispering. I tried to reel it in, but it wouldn't budge. Then, without warning, I felt a counterpull, as if something beneath the water was tugging from the other end. I glanced at Thomas and saw he was pale, staring into the water beside the boat. "Marcus, do you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I looked where he was pointing and saw a pale patch beneath the surface. It was widening slowly, drifting closer to the boat. Then I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. It was a human face, a small child with distorted features and empty eyes, floating underwater, staring directly at us. I jerked backward so hard I nearly fell out of the boat. At that moment, my line snapped. I looked at my hook and found it bent completely out of shape, and as if something had yanked it with tremendous force. Thomas stood up and began rowing frantically toward shore, but the boat wouldn't move. The water seemed to coil around us, holding us in place. Then the boat began to shake, not from waves. The water was dead calm, but violent vibrations, and as if something was pounding the hull from below. We heard a sound like a woman's wailing rising from the depths of the lake. It was mournful and terrifying all at once. "We have to get to shore now," I shouted at Thomas. At that moment, the boat capsized. I found myself in the freezing water, searching for Thomas in the darkness. The lake water was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing. I felt cold hands grip my leg, pulling me downward, fingertips that were far too long, skin as smooth as the dead. I kicked with all my strength, swimming upward with desperate urgency. I finally broke the surface, gasping for air. I saw Thomas swimming away from me, screaming something I couldn't understand. I swam after him with everything I had. The water was so cold my limbs were going numb. We reached the shore exhausted, shivering from both cold and terror. I looked back toward the lake and saw 5 white figures standing on the water's surface, staring at us. They weren't walking on water, they were floating above it. An entire family, a man, a woman, and 3 children. I put on my wet glasses to see clearly, but they vanished instantly. We ran to the car without looking back. On the drive into town, Thomas told me he had seen another face beneath the water, an old man's face with no eyes, grinning at him with a wide smile full of sharp teeth like a shark's. We never returned to Lake Minnetonka. I sold all my fishing gear a week after that incident. But I still wake up at night drenched in sweat, remembering the coldness of that water and the hands that didn't let me go easily. And some nights when the house is quiet, I hear water dripping somewhere in the house, even though all the faucets are tightly shut, and I swear once I found small wet footprints on the bathroom floor, the footprints of a small child leading from the drain. Thomas died in a strange drowning accident last year. The report said he drowned in his bathtub, but I know the truth. They never let us go. They never let anyone who visits their lake leave alive. I'm Jacob Wilkinson, and I've lived in the English countryside my entire life. Our area is full of old farms and dense forests stretching for miles. But there's one place everyone avoids, the old Harrington farm. The farm had belonged to the wealthy Harrington family until 1891, when all family members vanished one night. No trace of them was ever found. They left behind a large house, sprawling farmland, and a small pond at the edge of the property. Since then, no one has dared to buy the land. The villagers say the place is cursed, that strange sounds come from the direction of the pond on moonlit nights. But my friend Oliver Hawkins was different. He believed only in science and scoffed at superstitions. He was a skilled fisherman and insisted that Harrington Pond was filled with enormous carp that hadn't been disturbed in over a century. He convinced me to go with him one weekend. Saturday morning was unusually bright and warm. Oliver drove his car down the dirt road leading to the farm, the tangled trees forming a green tunnel above us. When we reached the old iron gate, I noticed it was slightly ajar, as if someone had been there before us. Oliver shrugged and said the wind must have blown it open. The house was large and abandoned, windows shattered, doors gaping open. We cut through the backyard toward the pond. It was a small body of water, its surface black despite the bright sun. The trees surrounding it were bare and dead, even though it was mid-spring. Oliver eagerly set up his equipment while I felt a strange tightness in my chest. The place was eerily silent. No bird song, no insects, not even the sound of wind through the dead trees. The only sound breaking the silence was our fishing gear clanking together. "Look, Jacob, this spot is perfect," Oliver said, casting his line into the black water. "I bet there's a carp the size of a small dog in these waters." I sat on a rock near the shore, watching the still water. An hour passed without any movement. 2 hours. Oliver began showing signs of frustration. Then suddenly his rod bent sharply. It nearly flew from his hands. "I've got something big," he shouted excitedly. But his expression quickly shifted from excitement to confusion, then to horror. He was pulling hard on the line, but couldn't lift whatever was on the other end. I watched him struggle, the muscles in his arms bulging with effort. "It's too heavy. It's like I'm pulling up a person," he gasped. I moved closer to help him. We gripped the rod together and pulled. Suddenly I felt a strong counter-tug, as if something underwater was playing tug-of-war with us. Then, slowly, something began to surface. It was a large, dark mass. At first I thought it was an old tree trunk, but as it neared the surface, its shape became clear. It was a cow. A dead cow, bloated and rotting, wrapped in rusty iron chains. But the most horrifying part wasn't the cow itself. It was what was carved into its decaying hide. Words cut with a knife. "You will never leave." Oliver stumbled backward, gasping. The rod slipped from his hands into the water. He was as pale as death. Oh God, Jacob." Before I could respond, we heard a sound coming from the old house, the sound of a door slamming shut. We stared at each other in terror. We were certain we were alone in this place. "Probably just the wind," I tried to reassure him, though I didn't believe my own words. Then we heard another sound. Footsteps on wooden floorboards, coming from the second floor of the house, a steady, heavy rhythm as if a large person was walking with deliberate slowness. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. We began gathering our gear quickly. I kept glancing toward the house, and at one point I saw something that made me freeze in place. There was someone standing in one of the second-floor windows. It wasn't just a trick of the light or a reflection. It was a clear human shape, tall and impossibly thin, standing perfectly still, staring directly at us. "Oliver, there's someone in the house," I whispered. Oliver slowly raised his head toward the window. At that moment, the figure opened its mouth. It wasn't a normal mouth. It stretched to cover half its face, and it let out a sound I'd never heard before. Something between nails on a chalkboard and a newborn's cry, but so loud the ground seemed to shake beneath our feet. We ran. We ran like we had never run before in our lives. Behind us, we heard heavy footsteps emerging from the house, chasing us across the field. I didn't look back. I could hear Oliver's ragged breathing beside me, our footsteps on the grass, and the footsteps of something else. faster and heavier. We reached the car and jumped inside. Oliver turned the key with trembling hands. The car shot forward, dust flying behind us. In the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the dirt road. It was extremely tall, taller than any human, wearing old clothes like those of a 19th century farmer, and it was waving at us, slowly, with an unnaturally long arm. We reached the village, collapsing from terror. Oliver insisted on going to the police, but what would we say? That a dead cow with a threatening message was in the pond? That a tall man with a deformed mouth chased us? A week later, a farmer reported 3 of his cows missing. They were found in Harrington Pond, chained together, with the same words carved into them: "You will never leave." As for Oliver, he was never the same. He began drawing pictures of a tall figure with a wide mouth standing in his windows at night. He told me the figure visited him in his dreams, whispering things about the Harrington family, how they had all disappeared beneath the pond's waters on a rainy night after hosting a strange visitor who refused to ever leave. Oliver has moved to another city now, far from the countryside. But he sent me a short message a month ago saying he had seen the figure again, standing on the opposite sidewalk from his London flat. And it was carrying an old fishing rod and smiling. "I will never go back to Harrington Farm. I will never fish in any pond again. Some waters don't forget those who disturb their peace, and some visitors never leave." I'm Lucas Anderson, and I've worked as a hunting guide in the mountains of Glacier Valley, Montana for 15 years. I've seen almost everything these mountains have to offer. Massive grizzly bears, mountain lions, sudden snowstorms, but nothing I've seen before compares to what happened in the winter of 2021. A group of 3 foreign hunters had hired me for a 3-day hunting trip. Richard Campbell, an English businessman in his 50s, his 25-year-old son William, and their German friend Klaus Wagner. They were looking for a massive bull elk and had paid well to be taken to a remote area where hunters rarely venture. It was late December and snow covered everything. Temperatures dropped well below zero. The area we headed to was called Whisper Valley, a name given to the place by Native Americans centuries ago. They say spirits dwell in that valley and they whisper the names of hunters who will soon die. Of course, we were practical men who didn't believe in such superstitions. We set out in the morning under a clear sky, the sun gleaming off the snow almost blindingly. We walked single file, me in front, then Richard, then William, and finally Klaus. It took a full day of trudging through deep snow to reach the valley. When we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting long blue shadows across the white snow. We set up camp in a sheltered area among giant pine trees and lit a fire for warmth. That first night was eerily quiet. Mountains in winter are usually silent, but this silence was different. It was a heavy silence, as if the mountains themselves were listening to us. I felt like we were being watched from between the trees, but whenever I turned to look, I saw nothing but shadows and snow. The next morning, we began hunting early. We walked through the snow for 2 hours before finding elk tracks, fresh tracks, maybe only an hour old. We followed them eagerly, moving as quietly as possible. Richard and William were excited. Klaus was unusually quiet. "Do you smell that?" Klaus suddenly asked in a low voice. We all stopped. I took a deep breath. There was a strange odor in the air. Not an animal smell, not a plant smell. It was something burnt but different, the smell of burning hair and flesh. I looked at Richard, who seemed confused. "Maybe an old forest fire," I said, trying to explain it, though I knew fires don't happen in December in this much snow. We continued tracking until we reached a clearing between the trees. And there, we saw something that made us all stop in our tracks. There was a human-shaped figure made of tree branches hanging from a large pine tree. It was about 6 feet tall, with a head made of bark and eyes made of 2 black stones. And there were strands of actual human hair attached to its head. "What the hell is that?" William whispered. "Maybe a prank from some hunters," I said, but my voice was shaking. Then Klaus noticed something else. At the foot of the figure there was a patch of ground with no snow, We approached cautiously and found that the snow had completely melted in a circle about 10 feet in diameter. In the center of the circle were ashes, small animal bones, and the partially burnt sole of a human boot. "Let's head back to camp," Richard said firmly. "This place isn't safe." As we turned to leave, we heard a sound. A whisper, but loud enough for all of us to hear. It was calling a name. "Lucas." I spun around. No one was there. I looked at the others. Their faces were pale. They had heard it too. "Who said that?" Klaus asked, his voice trembling. No one answered. We began walking quickly toward camp, the snow crunching under our feet. Every so often the whisper would return, this time calling Richard's name, then William's, then Klaus's. We reached camp gasping for breath. The fire was still burning, but the tent looked like it had been disturbed. Richard's bag was open, its contents scattered across the snow. Worse, his rifle had been completely disassembled, its pieces arranged neatly on a nearby tree stump. How could they do this so quickly? William wondered. We were only gone for 2 hours. We decided to leave immediately. We began gathering our gear quickly and resolved to hike through the night rather than spend another minute in this valley. The sun had set and darkness enveloped everything. We switched on our headlamps and began the journey back through the mountains. After an hour of walking, I realized something horrifying. We were walking in circles. I saw the same distinctive pine tree we had passed 3 times before. I stopped. "We're lost," I said. This was impossible. I know these mountains well, but the compass was spinning wildly and the GPS wasn't working. Even my cell phone showed no service, even though we were at a high elevation that usually had good reception. Then we began hearing footsteps in the snow around us. Multiple footsteps coming from all directions. We shone our headlamps toward the sound but saw nothing, only shadows, snow, and the sound of approaching feet. "The spirits of the valley," Klaus whispered. "They're real." Suddenly, we heard a wolf's howl, but it wasn't a normal howl. It was closer to a woman's scream. Another howl followed, then another, until the entire mountain seemed alive with these terrifying sounds. The howling stopped abruptly. Dead silence. Then, from the darkness ahead of us, a faint light appeared, a pale blue light moving slowly near the ground, like a torch carried by an invisible hand. "Who's there?" Richard shouted. The light stopped. Then it began to rise slowly from the ground, higher and higher until it was 20 feet in the air. Then it split into 3 lights, forming together the shape of a massive human face in the dark sky. It was an old face with empty eyes and the mouth open in a silent scream. We didn't wait to see more. We ran through the deep snow, stumbling, falling, getting up again. Behind us, the light followed and the whispers of names continued. Lucas, Richard, William, Klaus. We found a small cave in the mountainside. We hid inside, shivering from both cold and fear. We stayed there until dawn broke. In the morning, I found the way back with strange ease. It was as if the valley wanted us to leave. Or perhaps we had stayed long enough and it was someone else's turn. We reached my car that afternoon. We didn't exchange a single word the entire way. Before getting into the car, I looked back toward the mountains. I swear I saw a figure standing on a distant cliff edge waving at us. It was a human shape, but it wore no clothes despite the freezing cold. And its mouth was far too wide, stretched open in a smile that couldn't possibly be human. I never returned to Whisper Valley. I quit my job as a guide and now work in a small shop in town. But on some nights, when the cold wind blows down from the mountains, I hear whispers calling my name. And sometimes, when I look at the snow falling outside my window, I see footprints leading to my front door and vanishing suddenly, as if their owner had evaporated into thin air. Richard, William, and Klaus returned to their countries. But Klaus sent me an email 6 months ago saying he had seen the face in the sky again, this time above the streets of Berlin. And it was smiling, and it was calling a new name, the name of someone else who would visit the valley soon. Some places never forget those who visit them, and some faces never disappear, even after you've left the mountains thousands of miles behind.